What's up, everyone, and welcome to the Renewable Energy Smart Pod. I'm your host, Sean McMahon. Joining me on the pod today is Steve McComb, Senior Vice President at IncubEx, and we're going to be doing a deep dive on the market for renewable energy certificates, which are also known as renewable energy credits, but most commonly referred to by their acronym, RECs. Now, I have a bit of a funny confession to make, and I know I might be dating myself here, and definitely sharing too much information about the music I used to listen to back in the day. But every time I hear or say the word Rex, I think of the old hip-hop group Rex in Effect. So pardon the turn of phrase when I tell you Steve and I will be breaking down the effect the trading of Rex has on renewable energy markets. Every day there's another headline about more and more renewable energy assets coming online. So coming up in the next few weeks, we've got a pair of episodes that will focus on the people who will be buying all that renewable energy. Miranda Ballantyne is the CEO of the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance, and she'll be joining me to talk about how large-scale energy buyers like Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Walmart, and many, many others are reshaping the renewable energy procurement process. While Miranda and the members of REBA represent big buyers, we've also got an episode coming up that focuses on the plight of people looking to purchase renewable energy on a much smaller scale. I'm talking about individual homeowners and consumers. Greg Hopkins and the team at RMI have called for changes to the green mortgage market. So we'll be hearing from him about how individuals can leverage that market to increase their renewable energy purchasing power. So, lots of great content on the way. But before we start talking Rex with Steve McComb from IncubEx, I want to say a quick thank you to the sponsor of today's episode, Infor. Infor is a global leader in industry-specific cloud applications to support critical business needs. Infor solutions are tailored to meet the needs of solar and wind generation asset owners. More than 350 utilities organizations rely on Infor's cloud-based ERP solution to ensure their assets and infrastructure are safe and reliable. Hello, everyone, and joining me today is Steve McComb, the Senior Vice President from IncubEx, and today we're going to be talking about renewable energy certificates. Steve, how you doing today?
Really good. Yeah. Thank you for having me on.
Glad you can come on here to share some of the knowledge the team at IncubEx has about RECs. So let's get right into it. Walk me through what renewable energy certificates are, how they work, who generates them, and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really a pleasure to be here. So effectively, renewable energy certificates, or RECs, are certificates that are generated along with electrical power when it's generated. They're tracked, they're created in electronic registries. There are 7 or so registries across the country, generally speaking, sort of the power grids as we know them. A good example that's been in the news a lot recently is ERCOT. Texas has their own sort of renewable energy registry. And so these certificates are generated at the same time as the power is generated. And it's the unit of trade and measure is 1 megawatt hour in the same way that electricity is measured in that way. They are transferred and bought and sold in these registries. And they typically are used to represent either the renewableness of energy or the claim on the consumption. A good example here would be, say, a Google who's looking to make sure that the energy they use to power their searches is renewable. And so they would buy these renewable energy certificates to do that. Typically speaking, the major demand side of this is either voluntary or commercial demand, or the other one is sort of a regulatory mandate where folks are required to do this by fiat.
And so real quick, what kind of pricing are we talking about here? So if Google does want to go buy a certificate, what's the price variance?
It's a really good question. And it typically sort of varies by region and by sort of demand type. You have, various programs run by various states where if the requirements that they've set up under what we call a renewable portfolio standard, which is a state mandate for certain amounts of renewable energy to put into the grid, if those requirements are fairly stiff, you'll see some very high pricing as renewable energy generators try to meet that high demand. So you can have prices for a megawatt hour as high as $200 and as low as earlier, this year we saw, 90 cents. So it really depends on what the supply demand dynamic is in that region and sort of the difficulty of putting in certain types of technologies.
All right. And just real quick, let's back up a second. So what are the essentials of a renewable portfolio standard?
Typically what you've seen is states mandating certain types of renewable energy. So they would mandate, a certain amount of wind, a certain amount of solar production from certain regions that qualify into their programs. And they would, generally speaking, classify them in groups. So you'd have class one, which would be your sort of more industrial or more fluid type of criteria, which would be wind and other high volume renewables. And then you'd have segregated classes for solar and others that are typically harder to develop, or at least were at the time that these things started. So the politicians tend to stratify it into groups, maybe based on their regional attributes as well. So in states and regions that have large sort of forestry components, you very often see a biomass element to the renewable portfolio standard. In others where you're close to the ocean or whatnot, you'd see offshore demand or offshore programs as well. And so those offshore ones are just getting going. So they're very often trying to incentivize jobs, renewable jobs in those regions. And so they will tailor the design of the regulation to meet those requirements.
And now when we're talking about who can buy and sell renewable energy certificates, who are we talking about? I mean, this isn't the Wall Street bets gang on Reddit, right? We're not GameStop in this thing, right? Who can participate in these markets?
Yeah, so anybody can participate in the market. I mean, if you're a motivated individual, you could trade it, but you're right. It's not typically traded in that way, right? It is most often traded by, energy firms, electricity firms. I think you had EDF Renewables on your podcast recently, and they're a large developer in the space, and so that would be sort of along the lines of someone that would be a natural participant in a market like this. That's sort of an example of folks who do the development, but they need to find funding for their projects. Very often that funding comes along with, from a bank. Those banks would be typically hedging their exposure to some of these projects. So you'd have banks hedging there. You might have funds who have gone ahead and funded some of these projects, and you'd have funds. And then you have also the great number of sort of liquidity providers in the market where they have exposure as a result of trades or originated deals that they've done. And so that's who's typical in the space. It's not really individuals. You would get access on an exchange like the one that we're partnered with called Nodal Exchange. That's not something that you sign up for on Schwab or Reddit or
Robinhood.
Robinhood. There you go. There's not something you sign up for on Robinhood, but it is a market that's available. It's just you have to be relatively motivated to try to get into that area. So looks a little bit more like trading wholesale beans and corn than it does GameStop.
And now you mentioned earlier how the different states can kind of have different pricing in terms of mandates. How the different mandates will affect pricing. So walk me through a little bit. Where do those state rec mandates come from? What are the ins and outs of the renewable portfolio standards?
Yeah, that's a good question. So before we got on here, I actually searched it up, and it looks like the first state mandate came from Iowa, where they wanted to see a certain amount of renewable energy production in their grid. Now you have 30 states across the U.S. and the District of Columbia that have programs that mandate a certain amount of renewable energy. Whereas in 2006 and 2007, we had 4 futures contracts that served this market. Now we have more than 50 to serve the market, and so it's growing significantly. The number of states that are participating in it is ever increasing, and the mandates that those states are putting in place is increasing a lot as well. One of the early days, the targets were very typically sort of 10% by 2010, 20% by 2020 types of targets like that. Now you see 30% by 30, 50% by 50, and certain sort of more aggressive states going to 100% as well.
Now, doesn't California, aren't they aiming for 100%?
They're aiming for 100%. Absolutely. And so, you see that trend happening a lot now. And it looks like, even the Biden administration is looking for sort of more zero carbon electricity grid, into the future. And so what's interesting, I think, as a trend in this space is not necessarily that what the states are mandating. Certainly that's a big, big driver, but also it seems like consumer demand has shifted, and this should be, in order to sort of be a growth company, you have to have a strategy in renewable energy and to fuel yourselves that way.
And now you mentioned earlier the difference between, or how some states have a mandate and others are voluntary. So what are the basic elements of a voluntary renewable energy certificate market, and what makes them appealing as opposed to state mandated?
I think the The best example of a state that sort of has both is probably Texas. Texas has a requirement for renewable energy in their grid, and they also have a very, very active voluntary market. The main difference is that on the voluntary side, it's a little bit harder to define. It's anybody that wants to buy these things for whatever reason they may want to buy them for. But typically, you see the major driver of demand being net zero commitments that these corporations have made. So that's kind of what is the primary sort of backstop for the voluntary market. What's interesting in that voluntary market is you've had sort of a standardization of the standard of what is the voluntary market. So there's a really good organization out of California called the Center for Resource Solutions. They have a program called Greenie Energy, and that has become the de facto national standard for what is a voluntary REC. And so they've done a very nice job of helping grow this market. They've been around for 20 years doing the same thing, and it's been very positive. What we've seen recently at being an exchange and certainly measuring or being a partner of an exchange and measuring our success by volumes on the exchange, in the last 18 months, we've seen volumes in renewable energy from Texas, primarily driven by voluntary demand, increase significantly. We've gone from 0 to 15 million megawatt hours in that time. Just to put that into perspective, that's about enough energy to power 2 million homes for a year. And so that's the growth of forward commitments in renewable energy from that region. And those commitments on the partner exchange nodal extend through 2031. At that same time, we've seen prices increase from sort of 90 cents per megawatt hour to $3.20 per megawatt hour. Still arguably relatively inexpensive on the basis of power cost, but a significant shift and a significant increase in apparent demand for that product.
And now you mentioned earlier how some states, the RPS, the renewable portfolio standards, are evolving, where years ago they were just aiming for 10% and now it's climbing 30, 40. California's at 100. What kind of impact is that having on the market for RECs?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, ever increasing sort of demand is increasing prices in certain cases, and also backfilling sort of other things that are happening in the electricity market. So I think the trend is bullish in the sense that there will be continued growth. Policy is pushing for that continued growth. So you see, like we mentioned before, California's targets. All the 30 states have fairly aggressive targets, and they're continuing to be satisfied by the good work of EDF, as you had on your show. And so that will continue to sort of be on the growth side of it, and that's going to fill in some of the stuff that's out there. So the coal shutting down, not necessarily as a policy decision, but it's just shutting down because it's not economic anymore. So you see the new renewables filling that void that's been left by sort of facilities that are just not in the money anymore. But you also see other forms of demand that are coming from the ever increasing trend towards electric vehicles and so on. So that it's a very strong sort of supply side and also a very strong demand side. So on both cases, a push upwards.
All right. And now, so there's 30 states plus DC that have some form of RECs. So are there any states that are more actively traded or where the prices are more lucrative than others?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's a really good question. Of the states, probably the most liquid market is what we call in the market PJM. PJM is the acronym for Pennsylvania, Maryland, and New Jersey. And those states have rules within them that are generally aligned with respect to what is eligible to satisfy the state mandates. And so as a result of that, there's some standardization in the underlying product, and you can trade the underlying REC and satisfy any one of the three requirements. And so that helps a lot to build a bigger pool of liquidity and a bigger pool of supply that can then be used. So that's a very actively traded market, and for both the class one or let's consider the wind type REC and the solar REC as well. And New Jersey is the primary and most actively traded solar market. The other one on the voluntary side, if you will, Texas tends to be sort of your benchmark there, and it would be the most active. But even in that example, it's kind of interesting to see, because if you stack sort of what's most expensive, least expensive, just on a comparative basis, you've got $200 solar credits in New Jersey, you've got 19 or so dollars in PJM as a class 1 or a wind credit, and then you have $3.50 for wind in Texas. So the markets are not fungible yet, but they're very actively traded.
All right, Steve. So help me understand how the different markets function. So we've talked about how PJM or ERCOT have different pricing and different standards. How does that affect the overall market?
It's interesting, so it's also hard to define in some respect because the rules in each market are different. So you could kind of classify each market as the state set of rules. So Pennsylvania would have a set, New Jersey would have a set of rules, and Massachusetts, Connecticut, and whatnot. The participants in those markets would then be looking at those rules, trying to optimize and find the best price that they can get for the asset that they have. And so they would be looking to either build in a certain region, or if it was eligible, flow electrons to a certain region via transmission so that they could capture sort of the highest price for the asset that they're trying to manage. And so, depending on the sort of set of criteria that they have, be it transmission, the rules for the state and whatnot. So they're constantly looking at those types of things in order to optimize and get the best value for both the REC, but I suppose in combination, the electricity as well.
Are there any markets that, for lack of a better word, do it the best or make it easiest for traders to operate?
It's interesting, and it sort of comes at a hard time to say that, Texas does it best, right? We saw
really. Why don't you want to say that, Steve? I don't understand.
That's certainly, it's certainly fraught with, lots of contention, but where markets, I've always been a fan of maybe, policies and then hands-off implementation. And so, for us, we look at, where the development is happening and where the markets are sort of free to express themselves. And Texas is a good example of that. Now, that being said, most of the activity historically and through to now is really in the PJM region. And so, it's hard to say that they're not doing it best, because they have some minor amount of standardization amongst the rules, which is really helpful. And so that's a good example of where you're getting pools of liquidity and sort of momentum in a market where folks can be comfortable with making investments because they have various different places to outlet that supply. So maybe a competitive toss up between sort of hands off and in Texas and some tighter but coordinated management in the PJM area.
So how often do these credits change hands? I mean, if a company buys one, do they just sit on it, or is it kind of move around periodically?
It's a really good question. I think where we sit in the market as a participant in offering futures trading for it, we see greater turn frequency in the futures. So you would be trading, one time the underlying crop sort of as an entry level market where it's not super evolved. If you went to a market like corn and beans, I suspect they would trade sort of 20 times the underlying crop. In some fairly evolved emissions markets, it's sort of at a 6 times the underlying crop. So the futures trade, the actual transfer of certificates would be probably a fraction of that, because you could trade futures many times and actually only transfer the underlying once or twice. And in fact, more of the transactions would occur sort of either over the counter bilaterally between parties for forward commitments or as futures contracts than would the underlying sort of bounce around in the registry that much.
You mentioned how the markets aren't fungible yet. Is that anywhere in the distant future, like a federal REC market?
Yeah, I think a federal REC market, we certainly hope is on the horizon. I think that one thing, the trend that you see is what is acceptable both to, politicians is a reflection of what consumers will accept, and renewable energy, certificates or renewable energy markets or incentives for those markets is relatively well accepted as a way to deal with sustainability. And so I am very, encouraged by a common traded market for renewable energy, or at least clean energy, in the future under a federal program. And I think that would be very positive for the market, and certainly be great to pool a lot of the liquidity that is sort of set up in these pockets of markets that we have today.
All right, we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll hear Steve's take on how some of the big proposals coming out of the Biden administration might affect the market for RECs. Infor is a global leader in industry-specific cloud applications to support critical business needs. The Infor vision is led by crafting unique user experiences to support the business, starting from project development and planning through to digital tools for O&M. With solutions tailored for power gen and T&D enterprises, Infor is able to deliver speedy and reliable results, such as a 400% improvement on O&M productivity, 20% extension in equipment life expectancy, and millions of dollars of savings through controlling lifecycle costs of assets. And now, let's get back to our conversation with Steve McComb from IncubEx. All right, and then all the renewable energy proposals coming out of the Biden administration lately, do you see those affecting pricing or the shape of these markets?
I think what it affects is probably the mood more than anything. There's always been sort of lots of policy proposals and lots of hope for different things over time, both on the carbon side and the renewable energy side. And I think what you see here is just sort of almost it's a mere reflection of a lot of what consumer demand is just that, hey, there's a mood for more renewables on the grid. I believe there's almost an expectation from consumers today that at minimally some portion of their electricity is renewable, if not all. And so the federal policies to do that probably are just more encouraging and create more momentum around the thing rather than being reflected in prices yet.
All right. Now, we've been talking a lot about where things are now, maybe looking a little bit towards the future with Biden and his team. So what do you see there? If we're looking at these markets 5 or 10 years out, what does the rec market look like? We'll start here in the U.S. and then maybe beyond our borders.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the thing that we'll see is probably a continued sort of standardization of what the thing is. And so, a lot of the Biden policies have been not necessarily renewables, but zero carbon. And so, there is certainly a play for other types of energy that doesn't have a carbon footprint to it. So I think going forward, there will be a very actively traded certificate transaction market, and renewables will have a big chunk of that. And I think, that with all the technology development that we've seen and sort of the improvement and the services available to the market, that RECs will continue to be a big feature of it, and that you'll see a lot of new development into those markets. So that's very positive. I think that all the stuff coming out of that administration is good. And I also, at the same time, as you look at the various policies, renewable energy and clean energy seems to be very socially accepted. And so I think you would have a really, much more palatable policy implementation pathway under a renewable energy plan than you might under certain other emission reductions programs. Globally, probably some of the same stuff too. I think, Europe is doing much the same, and if not more. And as we've seen in Asia, China is some of the largest energy production for renewables. And so, I think the trend that we're seeing here is similar across the board.
And now, in terms of all the talk about greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets, you mentioned earlier how even consumers there's almost an expectation that part of their energy will come from renewable sources, and it's just more socially the norm, I guess we'd say, than 5, 10, 20 years ago. So how do these marketplaces, how do they fit into the bigger picture of achieving some of those, let's just call it rather ambitious greenhouse gas emission reduction targets? How critical are these RECs to that puzzle?
Yeah, I think they're a really good piece of the puzzle. Everybody, says stuff like, oh, we need all the tools in the tool belt. And I think that's actually true, So RECs are a very important piece of the economics for developers. If we take a look at New England, a REC is $45, power is $45. So, so that is a huge component of the revenue side for a developer. So, that's going to continue to be needed to incentivize new renewables into those regions and across the country. And so I think that, that's a big piece of it. Generally speaking, this is just sort of one of the pieces that will complement an emission reduction program. And so, to the extent to which we can see emission reductions come as a result of only renewables, that's great. There will also have to be some, outright emission reductions. But I think focusing on RECs as a growth story and a nice positive solution, as opposed to simply let's just tamp down all those emissions jobs, which we really can't do in the short term. I think it's maybe the flip side of the same coin, if you will, but maybe a brighter way to look at the issue. And also, one of the things that has always been the case, and we've seen this in markets historically, when under the acid rain program, there was a lot of talk about how this was just going to kill coal and kill the power industry, and you're going to be cold and wet, and the lights will be off at home. And that just didn't happen because technology develops and solutions evolve, and both costs go down and the lights stay on. And so I think that's what we're going to find as we push the envelope a little harder in developing sustainable solutions for this economy, both for direct emissions as well as just energy production.
And now, just a reminder that some of our listeners are brand new to this topic, right? And you mentioned a few minutes ago how in New England, price of power is at $45 and the REC's at $45. So how common is that? Where the pricing is right on or very similar, and how important is that?
Yeah, so it depends on the area. Another example would be New Jersey, where you've got solar credits for $200 and power. I didn't looked at it recently, but let's just call it $50. So it's, that there's a big spread between them. I think the price of the REC is extremely important to the developer to get these projects done. But for that, you wouldn't have solar in New Jersey, right? It's not Nevada, right? So it's, so that was the primary driver for why all that investment flowed to that region. And so those types of results will develop in certain regions as the policy is there to support it. So I think the RPS, those are important policy drivers and will create the results they're intended to. So it's important to have those things be sort of the right design and have the right blend of different technologies. So for developers, I think the answer would be it's extremely important. For us, what we see when we deal with our clients who are trading in these markets, that's a lot of their focus. It's a significant piece of the economics that they do have to hedge. So they have to hedge both. They have to ensure that they are managing the price risk in electricity and the price risk in renewable energy certificates. And both are very material to their bottom lines. And so that's why we're here as a service to make sure that they've got the tools in their tool belt to make sure that they can manage that risk.
And so if I'm understanding you correctly, when a REC is priced at, say, $200 and solar is at $50, that's good for a developer? Or how does that play into the market?
I think whatever the sum total is the highest would be the answer, right? If you're a developer, you just want the highest because you're gonna get the same number of megawatt hours of electricity that you produce is the same number of RECs that you get. So you just have two separate attributes, and one being the actual electrons that's all charged up, and the other being this certificate. And so to the extent to which you could add the two together and whichever is higher is the way to go, that's what will get it done. So it's going to be a balance of what the electricity market will earn for you and what the REC market will earn for you.
And now, are there any other trends out there, even beyond, REC trading or things like that, just renewable sector stuff that's caught your eye? We can get away from the financial stuff if you want, just cool technologies or things like that. I mean, you're dialed in, so I'm always curious to pick a brain like yours for what catches your eye.
In many respects, what we think are interesting are the things that we're trying to work on, right? So we've been talking this whole time about renewable electricity. There's a huge market, even a national market here in the US for renewable fuels, liquid fuels. And so that to us is a very interesting area that has a very interesting pricing dynamics and policy dynamics. Carbon policy, state carbon policy is interesting for us too, and I think it's interesting. But I would step back and say, well, those things are the market and they will evolve. What we sort of hope to see over the next number of years is the proper evolution of sort of financial services and markets and tools so that those markets can grow. And so we're focused on that. We think that's, extremely interesting and important, and we're going to try to help provide that.
Are you seeing more of the big banks get involved in these markets? And I ask that because there's been news lately about, I think Citi and maybe B of A or Goldman was, building out brand new teams just to help their clients decarbonize or, get on the path towards decarbonization. Are you seeing that at IncubEx, some of the tier one banks getting more involved?
Yeah, absolutely. We certainly are, but I would also say that many of those tier one banks have always been in there, but are probably now trying to grow their teams simply just to respond to the growth of interest from their clients. And so, whereas it might have been a 1-person team, now they're focused on building out a 6-person team or a 10 or more. Other examples of this are where the entire piece of renewables trading might have been half of the gas trader's job. And now it's not only half that job, but 3 others and 4 others. And so, it is a really interesting time in this market to see, all of the demand for employment really of people that know how to trade this market. And it's absolutely, it's fascinating. The banks are getting in, funds are getting in a bigger way, like just to say that they've been there already, but there is net new, and there's also sort of incremental growth within their participation, which is really positive to see.
All right. So now we get to have some fun. Steve, we do a little bit here on this show. It's a little bit of a fun poke in the eye of the creative and imaginative names that renewable energy project developers give their projects. So we call it renewable energy project or not a renewable energy project. I'm going to invite producer Tom in here in a second, and he's going to read off 5 names, I believe, of renewable energy projects. He's done some internet research. 4 of the names he's going to give us are real. One of them is not. And I don't have any clue. I'm getting back in the game here. I'm 0 for so far on getting these right. So I'm going to get back in and try and guess it with you. So Tom will be testing both of us. So Tom, take it away.
Well, hello, gentlemen. Thank you for the introduction, Sean. Great to have you aboard, Steve.
Thank you.
So the first potential renewable energy project is Sun Harvest Solar. The second, the Geysers Geothermal.
Geysers
Third?
Geothermal. All right, now keep going. Sorry, that's a good one.
That's your vote. I take it.
No, I'm just saying it's a great name.
Like Sean said, great names, very creative. The third contender, Cascade Run Dam. The fourth, Blue Mountain Geothermal. And last but not least, Loose Goose Dam.
Loose
Goose? Those names one more time.
All right.
Number 1, Sun Harvest Solar. Number 2, Sean's favorite, the Geysers Geothermal. Number 3, Cascade Run Dam. Number 4, Blue Mountain Geothermal. And last but not least, number 5, Loose Goose Dam. Steve, since you're our guest, you get to go first.
All right. I'll go with number 5. I'll go with Loose Goose.
Steve goes with Loose Goose Dam. And Mr. Ofer, Sean.
Oh, boy.
Your choice.
Well, I know that Sun Harvest is real because I spent some time on the EDF Renewables site and I saw it on there before I talked to their CEO. So I know that one is real. I'm not going to say that one. I got to go with, the Geysers Geothermal, because that is just, that's like the perfect name for a geothermal project, right? It's almost too perfect. So I'm going with that one. Someone that can't be real.
All right. Geysers Geothermal for Sean. So, as Sean said, Sun Harvest Solar is a real project.
I knew it.
The other one not mentioned that's a real project is Blue Mountain Geothermal. Sean, I'm sorry to say the Geysers Geothermal is a real project.
Ofer. The Ofer streak continues.
And Steve, I'm sorry to say Loose Goose Dam is a real project. So the winning fake project for the week is Cascade Run Dam.
Oh,
sorry, gentlemen.
That's the perfect name for a dam, though. How can that be fake? Cascade Run. All right. Well, thanks for playing along with that, Steve. I appreciate it. You're a good sport. I know that can be hard.
Absolutely.
There's hundreds of these projects all over the place, so it's not like anyone has an encyclopedic knowledge of them, especially me. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it, Steve. It's great to hear more about the rec market in general and kind of, how you and the team at IncubEx see it now and maybe taking shape in the future. So I really appreciate your time.
I really appreciate being here. Thank you very much. It was a lot of fun.
Now it's time for the pod brief portion of our show, and I just want to spend a little bit more time talking about recs. Steve did an excellent job of laying out how the market functions and the areas where it seems poised for growth. One thing I want to add is just a reminder that recs aren't always the perfect solution for everybody, nor were they intended to be. As I mentioned at the top of the show, soon I will be talking to Miranda Ballantyne from the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance, and I know she has some insights on when recs are and aren't a good fit. With companies shifting their focus from merely greening their operations to deploying new strategies that target decarbonization, recs aren't always available or an ideal match for some of the cutting-edge ways companies are investing and leading the energy transition. Now, financial markets have a pretty good track record of developing products to meet market demand, so it will be interesting to watch Steve and the team at IncubEx as they, and the wider renewables market, evolve with the rapidly changing needs of energy buyers. Well, that's our show. Thank you for listening. Once again, I'd like to thank the sponsor of today's episode, Infor. If you like this podcast, please share it with your friends and colleagues, and be sure to follow us on Apple, Google, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also follow us on Twitter, where our handle is @RenewablesPod. And if you'd like a daily dose of renewable news delivered to your inbox, head to smartbrief.com and sign up for the Renewable Energy Smart Brief. The Renewable Energy Smart Pod is a production of Smart Brief, a future company.